Hello. Welcome to the National Complete Streets Coalition new webinar series called Complete Streets 301, Putting People First. You can join the coalition and their special guests each month for a new topic related to creating streets and places that put people first. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which we're calling Building Complete Streets, the Developer's Perspective, co-hosted by Smart Growth America and the National Complete Streets Coalition. If you're wondering whose voice this is, my name is Calvin Gladney, and I'm President and CEO of Smart Growth America. And I'm super excited to be your kind of default host for this webinar because my background is actually as a real estate developer. And it's fun. Actually, the panelists on the webinar today are fellow developers and actually former colleagues and friends. So it's awesome to be part of a webinar that starts to show the intersection between real estate developers, real estate development, and the building out of complete streets. It's also important, and one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of the webinar, the larger connection to the Complete Streets movement that's being led by our coalition and the mission of Smart Growth America. We envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. So it really gets to our work is trying to create livable places, healthier people, and a sharing of prosperity that happens when you revitalize places. And if you think about it, often you can understand whether prosperity is being shared by the quality of the sidewalks in those neighborhoods, whether you see a diversity of people and a diversity of opportunities in communities and neighborhoods, and whether all forms of transportation and modalities exist in those communities, and one of those, and the basic infrastructure to get to those options in terms of modes is often the completion of streets, so that pedestrians, bikers, people with different levels of ability and the like all have a safe and proportional way to get around their community. One of the things I like to always talk about beyond just what we're trying to accomplish is what we're trying to undo or avoid. And you can see this visual, this arrow of the type of land use and the type of land use design, and frankly the type of development that some developers put out into the universe that we're trying to avoid. I mean, this visual shows you streets that, well, one, it shows you not a mix of uses, which would be a smart growth principle. It doesn't show the ability to sort of walk, ride a bike, you have other ways you want to get around, sort of ideas of micro-mobility and the like. I mean, this is a auto-dependent, auto-dominant land use pattern that really is representative of sprawl, and it isn't representative of the type of streets and multimodalities that we would like to see in America that gets you to those livability, that health, and that prosperity that we're talking about. You also see when it comes to this idea of complete streets that there are moments where the danger to the pedestrian, the inability to have a safe way of passage, the inability to have options, and again, this visual shows that this kind of auto-dominance and frankly auto-dependence that many of our communities and cities are trying to retrofit against. And so when we talk about complete streets, we're talking about having streets that do include cars, so we're not anti-car, we're actually pro-car but pro-all modes. And so this street is dominated by the automobile and creates a way that pedestrians may not feel safe, may not feel that their sort of rights and ability to passage are being heralded. And so we want to build the infrastructure that allows for a design that says everyone has an equal right of passage, not just the car. And so we're getting away from these visuals as well. This is more like what we want for you and your communities, and I imagine the reason why you're on this webinar is to learn more about how to do this. I mean, this just shows the importance of family, really gets to, and we'll show one more visual that gets to the idea of what complete streets means, difference in modalities, so you can use public transit, that the right-of-way is not dominated by the automobile, but you can see the ability for pedestrians, bikers, users of public transit all being able to get around, and we feel that's very important to the mission of Smart Growth America and how we get to our North Star, and the completion of streets, and frankly, partnering with the real estate development community and the private sector, who are the implementer of these, are very important. So that's why we're doing this webinar. I mean, it really gets to the way we use land is really a huge part, has a huge part to play in everybody's ability to move around, whether it's to get to home, to get to school, to get to work, to their places of worship, to actually have access to all the amenities that folks need to, live, work, and play in a reasonable way. And frankly, private developers are largely responsible for creating those places where people live, work, and play. As a former real estate developer, I worked at a company called Bridge Housing Corporation. If anybody's on the line from San Francisco, you've probably heard for Bridge. I was a private developer myself here in Washington, D.C., doing multifamily development as well as some single-family buy and flip. So, my background as a real estate developer, as a consultant to and with cities around the country, and having the pleasure and the honor of leading Smart Growth America really made me find that having conversations where the nonprofit sector, the public sector partner and understand what the private sector needs to create completer streets is important, and this webinar hopefully will help do that. The one thing I did want to also note, just in case folks didn't have the full picture, the National Complete Streets Coalition is a program of Smart Growth America. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations and transportation professionals committed to the development and implementation of complete streets policies and practices around the country. As you probably know, complete streets is the integration of people in place in the planning, design, funding, construction, operation, and maintenance of transportation networks. So we all like to say that some things are easier said than done, and frankly, getting to a place where communities around the country can benefit from complete streets is definitely easier said than done. So we're delighted to bring to you Michael Lander from Lander Group and Andrew Pang from Jair Lynch Development Partners to share the sort of market and regulatory forces that can either help or hinder a private developer's contribution to a complete streets approach. So we'll have the two speakers, and after those speakers, we're going to have a brief question and answer session. There's a chat box, so you can submit questions in the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen, and we will go through those questions and try the best as we can to answer them, leveraging the folks on the webinar. So first I'm going to introduce Michael Lander. Michael Lander is a real estate developer and broker, urban planner, speaker, new urbanism advocate, and expert on smart growth and transportation policy. As founder and president of Lander Group, a Minneapolis-based real estate development firm specializing in urban infill projects, he leads the planning, design, and development of commercial, residential, and mixed-use developments across the Midwest and California. Lander Group, alone and in partnerships with other firms, has designed, developed, and sold over 1,000 units and $200 million of infill residential misuse projects, both new construction and substantial renovations or adaptive reuse. Michael's commitment to higher quality urban development includes active roles as a member of Urban Land Institute, the Congress of New Urbanism, the Minnesota chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and the steering committee of our own Locus Coalition, which is, as you know, a national coalition of triple bottom line developers and investors around the country. And Michael has always been a great advocate and participant in our Locus Coalition, so we are always excited about that. Michael's also served on the jury and advisory services panels for the Urban Land Institute, on jury panels for the Minneapolis AIA and CNU, and he speaks regularly to local, state, and national industry groups and also acts as a guest lecturer to the University of Minnesota, St. Thomas University, Macalester College, the University of Miami, and Harvard University. So with that, without further ado, I'll introduce Michael. Thank you, Michael.
Good day. Thank you, Kelvin. It's great to be with all of you across the country. I'm joining you from San Francisco, where I started my building career in Sausalito, building floating houses over 40 years ago. This is my first presentation in a webinar. I have a smart growth person helping me with the slides I'm going to show you today to support my talk. But I'm really excited to be here. I've been an urban infill developer for 40 years doing small buildings, primarily in the existing places. I'm usually the second or third or fourth generation on sites. I often describe our work as parking lots to buildings, is the simplest description. That work has made me more interested in the space between the buildings and where we find the streets and hopefully complete streets in the best composed neighborhoods. And I'm going to really blow that up to a slightly bigger idea of the public realm, that full space between the buildings. And of course, in most communities, the street occupies a principal role. The first image that's up here is really just to describe where the best practice is, what I think is the goal of a complete street. I don't have as good images as I'd like to have. You could take a look at this yourself. It's Avenue Diagonal in Barcelona. And this major corridor across their city carries the traffic of a major urban highway system, while it provides just spectacular walking, this image of the center walking space. There are beautiful broad sidewalks on both sides adjoining the buildings as well. There are bike lanes, there's a tram, there's auto lanes, and as you see, beautiful trees. So it is really, in my opinion, the epitome of a complete street, serving all users also to stop and enjoy that public space. So that really sets the bar high. Of course, these cities are hundreds of years old. We're coming out of 80 to 100 years of building primarily for the automobile, which we're going to talk about today, and really the rebalancing of the use of the right-of-way that the Complete Streets movement has identified and in many cases begun to make legal or required. So that's great. I don't have an image, but some great work that was done by the Smart Growth Coalition with my locus colleague Christopher Lineberger, Foot Traffic Ahead, really takes a look at, well, what is the real estate value of these great places, these walkable places, these places that have great public realm, and demonstrates that city after city, the highest real estate values exist in the places with what we would call complete streets. There's a great economic argument to make in making these places, which is important because, as we'll talk about in a moment, there's currently very little funding. So the enhanced real estate value is clearly one place to look. If you could skip to slide 7 for a second. Down at our small infill level, we typically are working on a 20,000 square foot corner in Minneapolis, and a gas station or a parking lot that we're rebuilding. In both of these images, existing buildings. So we're doing a lot of new construction, 3- and 4-story buildings on 20,000 foot lots, and always paying a lot of attention to the space between the curb and the building face, which I describe as an orphan, as we'll talk about in a moment. But we think it adds value to the real estate. It's tremendous bang for the buck from a developer perspective in terms of the amount of investment you make in landscape or streetscape, bike parking versus the cost of hard construction. So we think it's a critical part of every project to rebuild the space that affronts ours. Again, that's typically public right-of-way. In Minneapolis, there's no requirement to do anything in that space, no street tree requirement or any pedestrian improvements at all. It is literally an orphan. We take a lot of our cues from a great book that was written by Jeff Speck about the walkable city. I encourage everyone to pick that up if you haven't. It really just talks about how you compose a place. And in the whole complete street world, I would argue that the street itself, the automobile space, gets virtually all the attention and resources. Let's pop up to slide 2 for a second. and that where the Complete Streets movement is bringing attention to the other modalities. In Minneapolis, we're really seeing a lot of progress in provision for biking. And so we are really heralded as a great bike network. We are, and we're developing more resources in that regard. But the bike community is as single-focused as the car community. It's all about the bikes. And a complete street is all about everyone. So we have to address the silos. And interestingly enough, the bikers who we love actually are as siloed as the car people. So we need everybody in the room to make a complete street. To slide 3 per second. Really, the first, second, and third problem in many ways is just the cultural condition. We are such a car culture across America and have been for 100 years that it's going to take decades to really change the way we think, and that has to precede things actually happening on the ground. So that car culture pops up for me as a developer when I'm proposing projects. Everyone that's meeting me from the city is talking only about the automobiles, how much parking, turning radiuses, access, backup, loading, all of those things are carefully laid out. A lot of attention is paid to them. No one is talking about the biking, provision for biking, maybe a remote code that says we have to have so many bike racks, but in terms of all the other dimensions of biking, and literally no one is talking about the pedestrian, the width of the sidewalk, the comfort of the sidewalk, the amenity of the sidewalk, the porosity of the buildings, the things that make up a great walking network. So the culture has left us really unprepared to really elevate the other elements of a complete street. We're still very much a 90% auto, and that extends to the right-of-way as well. Maybe to the next slide, where we've devoted virtually all of the right-of-way to the automobile and left very little for the pedestrians or the bikes. And it's very difficult to reclaim that space from the automobile. And in many cases, where we practice in Minneapolis, the sidewalk is already only 6 feet wide. And so to get a suitable pedestrian environment needs to grab right-of-way from the automobile, and that's very, very difficult to do. Next slide, please. When we talk about the right-of-way, this is just an image from Barcelona again, a great European city, but it just really helps illustrate that it's really the same space between the buildings as an American intersection, but it allows the car, it accommodates the car movement, but it doesn't allow the car to dominate the entire place. It makes a place to sit, to walk, to bike through there. The cars move very slowly. So this whole Complete Streets movement is really the reapportionment, the reuse of our public space. The good news is we have it. We have all this public right-of-way. We're seeing some really interesting initiatives to change people's perspective. The open streets movement that closes streets for a Sunday to allow people to use that space, much like this image in Barcelona, and get people thinking, oh, we actually have public space near us. We have just dedicated so much of it, 70% plus of it, to the automobile movement. We're rethinking that allocation, and the Complete Streets movement and idea and moniker and legal work really helps underwrite that work. Because one of the things we're finding as we do projects, we ask, well, who's going to improve the sidewalk or the street? Well, that's the Public Works Department, but they typically have no funding to do that. And again, really no staff that's attending to anything out of the automobile. So the sidewalk is of no interest to them typically, and there's certainly no funding for enhancements. So the work that we showed earlier was all privately funded by our group, and that's typically, you'll see typical repaving projects. They just redid a major corridor in Minneapolis, added a bike lane, took away on-street parking, but made virtually no improvements for the pedestrians. So once again, a good positive direction by adding great bike facilities, not enough attention to the retail businesses along the way or the pedestrians that both relied on that on-street parking for their quality of environment, the pedestrians to protect them, the businesses to serve their customers. So one of the difficulties when you're doing the work is the siloed handling of it, both the ownership of that right-of-way, what might be local, state, or federally controlled in the public works area, really no one attending to sidewalk, bike, that's really automobile, and so even the bike folks are siloed. So Integration is really important over the next years of rediscovering and actually making complete streets happen. The notion that we have complete participation by the various modes is really not happening now and needs to change in order to be more effective. Some of the most exciting breakthroughs to me, just in terms of practice, are often called tactical urbanism, where folks are actually asking for temporary permission to paint up an intersection green or put out some furniture and some trees to enjoy a space that's often dedicated to automobile, to reimagine it. And many of those initiatives have led to actual permanent changes. People go, whoa, that's great. Why don't we do that all the time? And in many cases, actually still accommodating the automobile, but really allowing the other uses to come forward as well. And then the success with property values. It's in the Foot Traffic Head Report. There's some other great research that ULI has done about the value of public space, again, all part of a complete street. In LA, they're rebuilding Pershing Square, their main public space downtown, and have gotten significant contribution from the adjoining private property owners because of the very clear case to be made about the significant increase in property value associated with being in great public realm, which by definition include complete streets. So there's clearly a business argument, and as Calvin pointed out, this place, this public place is for everyone, all of the people, all the economic groups, the entire range of our community owns that space, and we need to make it available for more of those people doing different things than just driving, and the Complete Streets movement is really important to lead because we're at the very infancy of this idea. We're really excited about where it can go because it just serves everyone across the board, and it's really win-win, and we like to practice that environment. So great to be with all of you today. I understand we have a lot of folks working in the public sector who have a huge role to help play to change the paradigm and to really realize this vision. So I look forward to hearing from Andrew and joining you for some questions and answers in a few minutes. Thank you. Calvin? Well, I will keep speaking until I hear from our coordinator. Calvin?
Thanks, Michael.
All right, very good. I'm
Appreciate
ready to turn
all
it
that.
over and await some questions in a bit. So.
Perfect. Well, now I wanted to introduce Andrew Pang. Andrew, who I have to say is the first part of his bio, is a former Smart Growth America staffer, so we miss you dearly. Andrew now is an acquisition analyst with actually my good friend Jair Lynch at Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners. Andrew is responsible for assisting the business development team in sourcing sponsored investment projects, including supporting the full range of investment decision-making and management. Andrew came to Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners as previously a program manager here at Smart Growth America, where he was a policy development and implementation team member. Andrew at Smart Growth worked in the intersection of real estate business and economic development across several of our programs. Andrew was also responsible for managing SGA's transit-oriented development program, working with communities across the country to maximize the economic returns on transit investments. Prior to joining SGA, Andrew spent 2 years in the Public Strategies Practice Group of a real estate and land use economics consulting firm. Andrew has co-authored several white papers on topics spanning livability, manufacturing, and microunits. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Environmental Studies from Tufts University. I present you, Andrew.
All right, thank you, Calvin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hopping on. I'm going to give a quick intro of our firm. Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners is a DC-based real estate investor and developer. I've been in business for about 20 years now, since 1998. We've completed about 70 projects thus far, totaling somewhere around 4.3 million square feet of development. That's largely in DC and then also in some of the outlying areas of DC, totaling about $1 billion worth of capitalized value. And then we have another about 2.3 million square feet in the pipeline worth another $1 billion. These span pretty much all of your typical urban, infill asset classes, from mixed-use residential, commercial, office, retail, and some institutional projects. That's both new construction, renovation, and we also invest in existing assets. We also invest in what we like to call neighborhood assets, so things like schools, charter schools, libraries, and recreation centers. And we developed the first LEED Gold and Silver certified public buildings here in DC. So I currently work on the acquisition side. As Calvin mentioned, I was previously at SGA managing the TOD program, and before that I worked in consulting in land use economics, so I've had a little bit of experience on both the policy and the advocacy side, and now on the development side. And that's really the perspective that I want to provide here. As someone who drinks the Kool-Aid, my personal thoughts about complete streets don't always have a lot of overlap with my professional opportunities in development to actually further them. In our case at Jair Lynch, for pretty much the vast majority of products that we do, which are urban infill or redevelopment projects, very rarely do we have control over the right-of-way. Although there are some instances, and I'll get to that with the case study at the end, but that doesn't mean that there can't be alignments. From a development perspective, complete streets are not just about the right-of-way. And I think it's worth thinking about the street as being from building facade to building facade and not just sort of the transportation network between the sidewalks. And so to that end, I want to drive home that well-executed complete streets means, thinking of transportation and land use as two sides of the same coin. And that really helps broaden the way that developers can contribute to the streetscape. That adds in things like street trees, curb cuts and access management, placement, and the amount of parking, articulating the ground level, whether that's through retail frontage or otherwise. It really starts to look a lot more like what you consider smart growth more broadly. But before we even get to how you influence decision making within those projects, I think it's also helpful to think about, from a developer's perspective, how deals get done. Thinking about what kind of deals they pursue, how developers underwrite their projects, what kind of investment criteria that they have, knowing that they need to underwrite for a certain return and that they're responsive to the lending community. I'm certainly not trying to imply here that developers don't care about complete streets, but say your average local developer with boots on the ground, they may have their own thoughts and feelings about the built environment. They may care very deeply about delivering innovative and neighborhood serving and mixed income, walkable projects, or they very well may not. And kind of regardless, pretty much all developers are beholden to three things here: market dynamics, the regulatory environment, and capital markets, which is how available and how costly capital is, and also what very specific capital partners might require. So no matter what type of developer they are, they're not always going to be in a position to necessarily assume a ton of risk to try and define an entirely new and untested type of product, unless there's a good chance of a high return from it. And that's kind of what a lot of real estate comes down to, is this push and pull between risk and certainty and rewards, which is not to say that developers don't care about the streetscape. They certainly do, and with the right opportunity, they could even take on additional costs to work towards improving it. And sometimes this is above and beyond what the city is already doing, but it's important that municipalities understand how to meet developers sort of where they are, right? We see this sometimes with bids, with business improvement districts where, landowners may voluntarily apply a tax to themselves to do anything from perform clean and safe functions to even comprehensively contributing to a broader economic development goal. What makes a big difference here for that to happen is if there aren't already shifting market forces towards complete streets and towards smart growth, then there needs to be investment, or at least the promise of investment, from the public sector. And things like new transit or capital improvements can be a major factor in how developers decide how to invest in the first place and where that investment should be made. It's much easier to achieve when there is, for example, a transit investment in place. In the case of H Street here in DC, even the promise of a fixed guideway streetcar really lured a whole lot of development, including us. We redeveloped the entire 600 block of H Street with the anticipation that there would be a much more comprehensive, multimodal, including fixed guideway transportation network there. It just adds that much more certainty to developers that the market will deliver on riskier, sort of first-in, market-defining type of project. And the reason I bring up transit-oriented development is because, at a very fundamental level, good transit-oriented development has a lot to do with complete streets, and that it has to be pedestrian-oriented. And so aligning a complete streets policy with where transit investments are being made generates high levels of leverage. But again, it comes down to neighborhood context. And obviously, if you're on this webinar, you probably already know that there are large secular trends nationwide pointing towards an increased demand for walkable urban product. But that's just not necessarily true of every project on the market, and maybe not even necessarily every neighborhood or entire submarket. So anytime you're in a position where you're intervening in a market, whether that's through regulatory measures or let's call them permissive or incentive measures, it's important to first understand what the market would deliver otherwise, so that you know how to tweak it in one direction or the other. And I think a great example of where this can be alternatively a success or hindrance is with zoning, and specifically with form-based codes. So if you're not familiar with the form-based code, typical Euclidean zoning divides by use, and recently it's gotten the reputation as having a tendency to mandate generous parking supply and limit density and just kind of otherwise prohibit innovative urban development. Alternatively, form-based codes use the physical form as the organizing principle of the code, which in my opinion certainly has lots of benefits. I think they're the way to go. But one thing that we've seen nationwide is that if planners don't consider the impacts these new policies will have on the local real estate market, it can have the unintended effect of making development more difficult without making it any more appealing, and in some cases could even end up ensuring that nothing gets built. Some examples are, let's say, requiring a certain percentage of retail frontage in a neighborhood that just can't support any more retail, which leads to vacant storefronts. Or requiring structured parking in a market that desires 4-story walk-ups instead. In that case, it doesn't matter if the parking is facing the street or hidden in an alley. You're affecting the demand for the product and sort of the quality of the assets that are being built. So Michael discussed projects existing in silos, and I also want to address the issue of the regulatory environment being siloed. And you really see this in communities across the country, whether they are big, small, Republican, Democrat, strong mayor, weak mayor, or sort of council manager form of government. Kind of everyone has this issue, and it's tough to rectify, where you may have very strong initiatives, let's say if it's for complete streets or transit-oriented development or for opportunity zones now, but there's the phenomenon of plans, programs, and policies that are maybe great on their own, but either aren't empowered politically and just sit on a shelf, so to speak, or you run into the issue of them not being reinforced across agencies. And this is a big thing for complete streets, especially when it comes to the impact of complete streets on sort of the rest of the built environment outside of just the road. A lot of the decision making that impacts how a streetscape ultimately looks, at least when it comes to real estate, can fall well outside of the scope of a complete streets policy, especially one that is specific to road projects. And so what you get is that various agencies may have talented staff with a strong knowledge of complete streets and a strong knowledge of the connection between complete streets and real estate, but they're not empowered to leverage their expertise to advance complete streets in the city. The other thing you get is plans, programs, and policies that may even work against each other, where let's say you plan for one thing, but then incentivize for exactly the opposite of that. A couple years ago, when I was wearing my SGA hat, I worked with a city in the Midwest that was planning a new transit line. They had federal funding for transit, and they asked us to review their TIF program, their tax increment financing program. And what we found was that the city's TIF awards not only did not include TOD priorities, in some cases that meant that they were being used to subsidize the very types of development that the city elsewhere in other plans said that they did not want, just because they were being spread so thin throughout the city. And that's not good, right? Because you're using your own dollars to essentially rebut, where you're making investments elsewhere. I think it's instead important to make sure that things are not only consistent with other development control documents, but also that they work from a process and implementation standpoint, and that they provide for the desired form of development. One example is in Bonita Springs, Florida. It's one of many cities right now that have a facade improvement incentive program. In 2014, they started tying their approval for this facade grant to design review based on design metrics articulated in the Complete Streets Plan, or else something else, so that they could combine both an environmentally friendly street redesign with this economic development incentive program. And it kind of takes a sort of large-scale framework approach in order to think about these things holistically. The city of Alexandria is another good example of, mitigating this kind of issue. Their approach is to take an interagency coordination approach from the get-go, starting from permit review, where everyone has to take a look. In order for any developer to get a permit for a project, they have to be required how they will incorporate complete streets into the project, because from the very second they submit a concept plan, they need to detail the site plan, the program, the building footprint, parking, traffic, stormwater management, architectural design, and that gets submitted to staff from all of the agencies that are relevant, consolidated through the planning department, and then comes back for comments. So I wouldn't be a very good developer if I didn't try to hawk my own wares, at least a little bit. So I want to talk about one of the projects that we are currently building in DC. This is the McMillan sand filtration site. It's been in the news quite a lot, locally at least recently. So McMillan is a 25-acre site that is currently owned by the city. It used to be sand filtration, and so there's a little bit of underground demo to be done for the filtration cells. You have these literal silos, in this case physical sand filtration silos, not metaphorical silos, that are considered historic and will become a part of the streetscape. We, as part of a development team, will be purchasing that from the district and then redeveloping it into a sort of large-scale master plan community that the city designated for us to integrate the site within the existing community, provide a mix of uses, create jobs and revenue, and activate the site. So there will be 3 new office and medical office buildings on site. We are responsible for 2 new buildings that will consist of a total of nearly 500 units, mixed use above ground floor retail with some designated senior affordable housing as well as mixed income housing kind of spread throughout the units. And then there's also going to be townhomes on the southern portion of the site. The city will be responsible for constructing a community center. Because this is a large-scale master plan development, this is actually an example where we will be responsible for the construction of the new roads. Our development entity will very directly be working with all of the land and all of the infrastructure. And so in DC, the city deployed something that we have called PUDs, planned unit developments, where it was an opportunity for us to go above and beyond what the regulations and zoning allowed us to do, but as a result we had to give other concessions back to the city. And in this case there was strong design review as part of the process. So in this image here, the lower image is what we had originally presented as a grocery anchor for one of our buildings, and they came back and said, we want a more articulated retail plinth, we wanted to address the street more, we want somewhere for patrons to dine outside so that there can be a sort of active streetscape on the sidewalk and not just have people walking back and forth across this pretty empty wall. We complied with that, and that went through a couple of different city departments for review. The city was also responsible for demolition and restoring of the sand filtration towers. We worked with them to help configure a design where they essentially became these sort of historic art installations into the street, and they're going to sort of line the median from there. In the future, there's the potential for us to maybe activate them with some pop-up retail uses. That's a little bit further along, so we haven't completely figured that out yet. But if you zoom in and take a look at the way that this street is designed, it's really only one lane of travel in each direction for how wide that street is, and the vast majority of the rest of it is used for either beautification or just kind of wandering around or just otherwise contributing to the kind of community look and feel that we were going for with this. So that is my example of a case study where we sort of applied both of these principles with regulatory and permissive incentives around both the actual right-of-way and the building. And with that, I'll turn it back to Calvin for questions.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Michael, as well. That was awesome, and both of your comments and examples and talk about best practices have generated a number of questions. So what I'll try to do, one is to batch them to a certain extent. So if you're listening, I may kind of aggregate the point of your question so that we can get more questions answered, as well as we'll tell you later, there'll be additional opportunity for the webinar participants to answer your questions if we're not able to get to them live today. So there were a number of questions that really got to how do you make sure that there are racial equity, or another way to say it, there isn't displacement caused by gentrification following the development and integration of complete streets. There were actually a number of questions relating to that. I think what I'll do here is I'll jump in a little bit, give maybe a comment or two, and then I'll hand it off to you, Michael, and then to you, Andrew, to follow up. So again, racial equity and protecting low-income housing and protecting against displacement from gentrification, how do you do that while developing and integrating complete streets? What I'll do is I'm going to give you guys a tip. It's an acronym, TIP, and you want to think about who's at the table, who's able to give input, and whose input is able to change the practice of what happens next. If you want to get racial equity, one of the things that I always say is equity and racial equity is not the default option. Unless you have a frame of when you're thinking about who should be at the table, how you get input from a broad spectrum of people, including members of communities of color, low-income or low-wealth communities, or folks who have been in communities that have suffered from disinvestment, unless you make sure those folks are at the table, are able to give their input, and you educate them enough so that their input is relevant and applicable, you'll never get to equity and the ability to prevent displacement of those folks that live in those communities. So I'll leave it to Michael and Andrew to kind of give more specific examples, but part of the point and way to respond to this is a process point, which is to say, in most cases when you think about complete streets, there's a planning process and then an implementation process. And one of the goals, if the outcome you seek is to make sure that there's racial equity when complete streets come to a community, or to make sure that those complete streets aren't one of the dominoes that result in displacement caused by gentrification, is to make sure you have the right people at the table who can give their input, are part of the decision-making class of folks, and then, frankly, are also part of the implementation of the complete streets infrastructure. First, Michael, do you have some additional thoughts, and then Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, Calvin. I appreciate your focus on the process. I think it's really important. I'd like to emphasize that we're really talking about publicly owned space that's actually owned by all of us. And when we invest in that, when we invest in a high-quality public realm, including adding other ways to move around, I feel like we're in service of a broad range in our community, not just those with automobiles. So sort of by definition, it really enhances the options for the whole community in a public space. And we know in the development community that it raises values, that our investment publicly in that space raises values. I think some of the negative consequences of investment that have been addressed through gentrification, I'd like to think that high-quality public realm could maybe deliver resources to the buildings themselves through their enhanced value to help provide affordable housing and some of the non-market conditions that we face in our major cities. We need resources. Some could come from an enhanced public realm, while at the very time it's serving a whole range of the community and providing beautiful places to walk and to bike and places for transit, ways for the whole community to move around. The wealthy move in single occupancy vehicles. And so really it's an investment in our whole community to invest in a high quality public realm, which includes complete streets. But we're really missing the mechanisms to capture some of that economic value to help address some of these other issues that are sort of collateral to complete streets. Yes, when we make great public realm, it increases value, it attracts investment, it drives up prices. We know that now. We need to get smarter about capturing that to ensure public benefit in the buildings as well.
Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with Michael's point about using complete streets investments to sort of drive value for the public realm more largely. And I also want to touch on something that Calvin said earlier about understanding the process point and having some intentionality about when and where to implement certain policies. I mean, when we think about, affordable lower income communities, and we think about those types of households where they choose to rent and where they choose to buy, a lot of times they may live farther out because they are price constrained within the more sort of central areas of a city. And in those cases, access to transportation is a big factor for them that can drive up costs so that, nowadays it's not just the cost of housing, it's the cost of housing plus transportation, and how much sort of push and pull is there the closer in you are versus the farther out you are. I mean, you don't want to have to sacrifice one thing just to, drive up your costs in another category. And it's really lower income communities that are the most reliant on good transit infrastructure and good walkable, multimodal streets, because they tend to be either, they have the potential to be more underbanked or, less likely to own a car or have to be forced to travel farther distances to get places. I also want to apply this to the idea of development regulations, of understanding, at a holistic level, where certain areas of a jurisdiction certain deployments can be the most effective. I mean, some smart codes only apply to certain areas of a jurisdiction that already it might be kind of hard to develop in, and in those cases can kind of unfairly oppose additional constraints and costs in those areas that essentially ensure that revitalization does not happen at all.
Well, thanks to you both for those responses. I'm going to batch another couple of questions, and actually one of the questions may be part of the answer to another of our questions. So there were a number of questions that sort of paint the picture of a conundrum of if you're doing development on a sort of multi-owner block, and there's multiple developers and multiple owners, how do you, particularly when it comes to infill sites, persuade developers to invest in kind of the complete streets network when they don't control the entire block and the rest of the redevelopment is years out? A corollary question that probably relates to that is, how do you, Michael and Andrew, think about the increased value of properties based on the implementation of complete streets? So one is a question about, well, when you don't control the entire development or like the master plan, sort of like McMillan, Andrew, what do you do when you're doing an infill site, but you really need that complete streets infrastructure to cover the entire block rather than just the one project you're doing? Any thoughts from either of you?
I could take that one because we're in that condition in our projects, a smaller site on a block where we don't control it, and bigger improvements are years out. If there is a public realm plan that imagines complete streets and an implementation plan, there might be an assessment program that might happen if and when those were going to improvement on each of the individual owners. If we're out ahead of that, or that doesn't exist, which in fact is in most of the situations, we really take, I'm from North Dakota, we take a very modest approach. We go, we have 100 feet of frontage. We're going to do that 100 feet like it should be done ourselves in the project. Sometimes we can afford it privately. Sometimes you have to raise money from other sources to fund that. But we try to demonstrate on our frontage what the vision might be like. And sometimes that helps people go, boy, we'd like some more of that. And it actually increases the pace of a larger program. But in so many places, there is no larger program. In Minneapolis, they're planning street after street after street to repave them and rebuild them, in many cases with bike lanes, but no one is attending to the curb to the building. Oh, that's the property owner. We're just going to put concrete there. So that orphan needs attention, and really, in many communities, it's going to be the private owner, frontage by frontage, block, 40 feet frontage, 100 feet frontage, one at a time. There isn't a larger energy, and again, that's back to the more tactical approach of demonstrating where we want to go when it doesn't exist.
And I would just add on that it's not necessarily a bad thing for things to happen at a sort of granular and project-by-project basis. I mean, I think, this stuff is often incremental, and it's a good thing when development standards are written to transform areas into pedestrian-friendly, transit-oriented places over time. And I think it's important for them to encourage developers to contextualize their projects to the urban fabric sort of envisioned by, let's say, a comprehensive plan or a sector plan, and favoring these kind of fine-grained infill and redevelopment that can occur over time, rather than favoring or requiring parcel assembly and large-scale redevelopment. Because then what you sometimes get is, a couple of projects here and there that might be good, but they create a new problem in that they are not connected over time, and then you get missing teeth in the development fabric. I would also add that there are ways that, if given the context of the project, this is necessary to try and incentivize sort of a larger scale master plan. Actually, McMillan is also a good example here. Things like the planned unit development, which DC has, can help encourage that type of land assembly. And in fact, for this project, we are part of a team of 3 developers. We're just doing the mixed-use multifamily and residential. The office and the townhomes are done by 2 other developers on different parcels of land. We branched together because we were able to negotiate with the city to collectively get more than we would have gotten individually in terms of zoning and other types of relief. But we had to, at scale, then collectively provide community benefits, green space, all sorts of things. And it sort of paid off for us because it was at scale and it wasn't something that we would have been able to achieve individually.
Thank you. I'm going to bundle a set of what I'll call tactical questions. And the question really is, what are the best arguments to convince political leaders and elected officials to follow through on design that doesn't focus specifically or only on cars, but also focuses on design for active transportation and transit, and reinforces the ability of people to walk and to create walkable places. As developers, what would you say are the best arguments that community members and residents can use with elected officials and planning commissioners and the like, who, as you said, Michael, may still be a part of and really believe in car culture and auto dominance? What are the best arguments for why they should change their minds that community members could use?
Well, I would suggest that our previous notions about social equity might lead the discussion, because again, what we're talking about is places for everyone and modalities for everyone, and that just does not exist in our auto-only single occupancy vehicles. So really trying to reach a broader audience. Health issues in our communities, the CDC has done a lot of documentation of the fact that we just ended up, nobody walks to school anymore because we redesigned our communities, and we're rethinking that, and the impact on obesity and so the connections between the community's health. And then really social. You think of the connection you have with the different kinds of people in your community, face-to-face on the sidewalk or on the train, or in the more intimate connections of biking rather than the isolation of the single car. So there's, and then economic, the proof, the foot traffic ahead, the ULI research is that investment in the public realm increases your real estate value, the wealth of your community, and so that creates resources to turn around and address some of these issues, these very issues we talked about, the downsides of gentrification, residents and small businesses being pushed out. That doesn't have to happen. with investment if we get smarter about it. So I think there's really no one argument, really a whole host of arguments that point to this direction.
And I think that one argument that community members and advocates in particular sort of rarely seem to deploy, but is something that's often on the mind of elected officials and municipal leaders, is a fiscal one, taxes and the municipal coffer. I mean, at the end of the day, at a sort of very cynical level, they're trying to balance the city's budget, right? And we know that there's very good research out there. In fact, SGA itself has done a good amount of this research, that there are fiscal benefits to more compact development. The more compact, the denser your city is, the less linear feet per person you need to run out for your sewage lines and your utility lines, the closer you're able to locate things like police stations, schools, fire stations. And so you get a lot of sort of economies of agglomeration by locating things closer, you reduce costs, and you increase revenue, and that ultimately benefits the city, that they can even deploy capital towards, other city improvement things, new schools, new libraries, whatever else they may have in their budget.
Thanks. We're going to do a quick speed round and give you each a 30-second shot at an answer. There were a number of questions that essentially asked, what is the best way to work with developers if you're an advocate for complete streets or greenways or any of this type of infrastructure? What are the best ways that you guys would recommend communities and advocates work with developers? And are community benefits agreements a vehicle that you can use to work with communities?
My answer is work with them openly, early in the process, and reasonably on the community benefits. There should absolutely be community benefits, but they need to fit into the market requirements, the constraints of the developer. So open and collaboratively, I think some of Andrew's stories suggest really best practices that don't exist across the country. So that's a place we really need to come together, the public sector, the private, to focus on these together early in the process and draw on the resources of the Smart Growth Network and others to help each side understand to the extent that they're missing. So.
Yep. Well, Michael took all of my best points, but I'll just add on to that developers very rarely go in with an agenda about what they want to do across their entire portfolio or across an entire city. Oftentimes, they're really thinking about things on a project-by-project basis. Given this parcel of land that I have, or this existing asset, and the existing zoning, and the existing financing, what's the best thing that I can do with it? And they don't tend to reach these decisions arbitrarily. And so I think it requires, as Michael said, getting in really early, but also just getting really smart on the project itself, right? Like understanding not only local market conditions, but like why one block might be under a different set of regulatory pieces and have a little bit more hair on it than another block, and sort of meeting the developer where they are there. And I think that can sort of introduce a world of community benefits that are a little bit more granular to the project and more project specific, and that makes them all the more feasible.
I'll second that.
And I'll third that. Thanks to both of you for those answers. And we got more than 15 and still counting questions. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all of the great questions you sent in. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, our Complete Streets team will publish a follow-up blog post that will answer the questions that we weren't able to cover today. There'll also be a recording of this webinar and the slides from this webinar. So if you go to the Complete Streets website or the Smart Growth America website, you can find that on our website next week. So I just wanted to quickly thank again Michael and Andrew for joining us today. I wanted to thank all of you from around the country, literally, who were participating in this webinar, wherever you sit. We enjoyed hearing about Michael and Andrew's awesome work, and we look forward to working with you guys on your future projects. And again, to all of the participants, thank you. We do this all the time, by the way, so make sure you join on November 12th is our next webinar. It's at November 12th at 1:30 p.m. And it'll be a webinar update on advocacy on Complete Streets that's happening on Capitol Hill. So as a thank you from the entire National Complete Streets team, thank you very much and have a good day.
stand by.